Hello, and welcome back to the Ultimate Piano Course by Joseph N. In the last video, we discussed many different intervals which we use as measurements between notes. Let's zone in on a few of those intervals and talk about what happens when we combine a few of them together to make a larger group of notes. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Let's begin by talking about a chord. A chord is simply three or more notes being played together at the same time. So for example, this is a chord, this is also a chord, and this is a chord. At the end of the day though, not every bit of music is going to sound as, well, ugly and awful as that. So instead, we have ones that we use more commonly called triads. A triad is named so because there are specifically three notes, and those three notes are all thirds apart. So for example, we begin with C, move up a third to an E, and we move up another third to our G. That has a much more pleasant sound, doesn't it? There are two different types of triads altogether. We have major triads, which is the one you just heard, has a sort of happier sound to it, and a minor triad, which has a darker or a sadder sound to it. Now there's a major and minor triad for all 12 unique different notes we can have, so meaning there are 24 in total. What we need to do now is figure out the triads for all 12 of our starting notes. We'll begin with the major triads, and for that we have two techniques, the 1-5-8 or the 1-3-5. We're going to start with the 1-3-5 because it uses scales, which we've used plenty before. So let's start with C major. Our C scale has no sharps or no flats if we think about the circle of fifths. C was at the top, no sharps, no flats. For the 1-3-5 technique, all you have to do is take the first, the third, and the fifth note of the major scale, and you'll have yourself the C major triad. So for this, we have C, E, G. So those were the first three notes I played earlier in the video. That is the C major triad, because it's the first, third, and fifth notes of the C major scale. Let's try another example. Let's look for the D major triad. The D major triad goes with the key of D major. So think about your circle of fifths for a second. C major has no sharps or flats, and move a fifth to the right, and you'll have one sharp, which was F sharp. Move again a fifth to the right, and you land on D major. And this will have the F sharp, and now C sharp. So, now that we remember our D major scale, we'll take our first, third, and fifth notes, D, F sharp, and A, and we'll have ourselves the D major triad. Now, listen to the sound of the D major triad and the C major triad. Notice how they both have that happy sound to it. That's because all major triads have this same happy sound. If we listen, that was all 12 major triads, all sharing the same intervals and the same happy sound. The other technique we can use is the 1-5-8. And this one doesn't actually even rely on scales or key signatures, but instead simply counting half steps. Remember, a half step was when we counted from one key to the very next key, regardless of color, like sharps or flats. In this case, we'll begin on C, and C will be number 1, and we'll count 1 to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that takes us to the letter E. We'll finish up by counting to 8 then. 6, 7, and 8. And lo and behold, we have the exact same C major triad. So in this case, you can simply count all of the half steps, and you'll achieve the same result with much less thinking about the circle of fifths, or any of the scales. This chord chart lists all of the major chords in all 12 of our keys. You can see the top row has C major, F major, and G major, all of which are entirely made up of only white keys. The next row has our middle key being a black key, with D major, E major, and A major. Our third row has the middle key being a white key and the outer keys being black keys instead. So we'll have D flat major, E flat major, and A flat major. The bottom row has a few arbitrary shapes that don't belong to any other chords. G flat major is all black keys. B flat major begins on a black key and ends on two white keys. And vice versa, B major begins on a white key and ends on two black keys. Now, those are the techniques for the major triads. For the minor triads, however, they're actually quite similar. The options for those are 1-4-8 or 1-flat-3-5. And again, we'll begin with 1-flat-3-5 because that pertains to the scales. For the C major scale, we had no sharps and no flats. So again, we pick 1, 3, and 5. But for the minor, we're going to take the 3 and make it a flat. So we're going to lower it by a half step to E flat. There's that dark, spooky sound, right? Let's try now D major. Remember, D major had F sharp and C sharp. So we had our first, third, and fifth again. D, F sharp, A. But for a flat 3, again, we're going to lower it by a half step. Not literally to a flat, but just down a half step from a sharp back to the white key. And there is that sound again. So listen to all of the minor triad sounds. Notice again, they all have that similar sound. Once again, we can opt to not use our scales by instead using the 1-4-8, which was very similar to the 1-5-8 from major, but instead of counting 5 first, you'll count to the 4. So we can start with C, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll land on that E flat. Continuing on, we have 5, 6, 7, 8, and we have C minor triad. This chord chart shows the minor chords in all 12 keys, once again arranged by chord shape. To begin, we have C minor, F minor, and G minor. Each of those has a black key surrounded by two white keys. The next row is all white keys containing D minor, E minor, and A minor. The third row is a white key surrounded by two black keys, beginning with D flat minor, G flat minor, and A flat minor. Once again, the last row contains arbitrary shapes not found in other chords. E flat minor is all three black keys. B flat minor has two black keys followed by a white key. And B minor is two white keys followed by a black key. When practicing all of these triads, make sure you remember the shapes of each triads as well as practicing how to build them. Try quizzing yourself by starting on random letters and seeing if you can build the chords using the methods we discussed above. Now that we know how to build the major and minor triads on all 12 unique starting notes, let's try to build them on the scale degrees of the major scale. Let's take a look at the diagram below. Here you can see triads built on every note of the C major scale itself. Remember, C major has no sharps or no flats, so when we build the triads, they're going to adhere to that major scale. So in the key of C major, our 1 chord, the very first one, will be a C major, C, E, G. The second chord is going to be D, F, and A. Again, no sharps and no flats, so that would make it a D minor chord. From there on out, our third chord would be E, G, B, which would be E minor, Our fourth chord would be F major, F, A, C. The fifth chord would be G, B, D, a G major. Our sixth chord would be A, C, E, A minor. And then the last chord would be B, D, and F, which has a different type of sound. It's not exactly a major or a minor chord. We actually call this a diminished chord, something we'll learn much later on. This pattern applies to all major scales the same way. The order of each chord is always going to be major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, and then diminished. Let's try another example beginning on D major. Once again, D major had F sharp and C sharp. So all of our chords that encounter F or C will always automatically be an F sharp or a C sharp. Let's try it out. For D major, our first note, we'll have a D major chord. For our 2 chord, we should be minor. Let me see that that's true. It's E minor. The third chord is F sharp minor. Our fourth chord ends up being a G major. The fifth chord is another A major. Our sixth chord is B minor. And lastly, we have a C sharp diminished chord for our seventh chord before we reach D major again. Let's recap everything we've discussed so far. We began by discussing chords, which is a group of 3 or more notes all played at the same time. The triad is a special type of chord where the 3 notes of the chord are all played a third apart. There were 2 types of triads, major and minor, each with their own formulas for figuring out the notes within them. For major triads, we had the 1-5-8 or the 1-3-5 formulas. We began with 1-3-5 because it related to scales and key signatures. By using the circle of fifths and different major scales, we could figure out that the first, the third, and the fifth note of the major scale form the major chord triad. For instance, in C major, C, E, and G were the first, third, and fifth notes and form the major triad. Another method of doing this was the 1-5-8 formula. With this method, we wouldn't need to use the major scales or key signatures, but would instead count all of the half steps between each note. From C, you would count up 5 half steps to get to the E, and continue up to the 8th half step to get to the G. And you would build the same chord as the 1-3-5 technique without relying on the key signature or the scales. For minor triads, the formulas were very similar. We had 1-4-8 or 1-3-5. The 1-3-5 formula did the same thing as the major scales, where we took the key and the scale itself and built a triad on the first, third, and fifth notes. The difference in this case was we took the third note and lowered it by a half step to make it a flat 3. In the case of C major, this would be C, E flat, and G instead of C, E, G. The alternative was 1-4-8. Again, you would count the half steps between each note. From C, the 4th half step up would be E flat, and the 8th half step up would be the G. For all of these major and minor triads, we noted a very powerful practice method by using these chord charts. By noting the shape of each type of chord, some all white keys, some with white keys and black keys in between, etc., we were able to find various shapes that we could use to memorize each of the positions of these chords. When we build a triad off of any of the scale degree notes of a major scale, we'll find that they always form the same pattern of major and minor triads. The first note of a major scale always produces a major triad when we build a triad off of it. The second note always forms a minor triad. The third note forms another minor triad, and the 4th and 5th notes both form a major triad. The 6th note forms a minor triad, while the 7th note forms a diminished chord, a type of chord we haven't quite learned yet. Again, another powerful practice method for these is to take any one of the 7 chords within a different key and see if you can figure out which chord it's going to be, major or minor. We always want to keep in mind the shape of every chord as we try to practice them on the piano as well. Make sure to practice these daily as we move on to the next video, and I'll see you there.